and you can hear me. I'm very happy to be with all of you today. Thank you very much for inviting me again. I also spoke at last year's UAD Myanmar, so I'm very happy to be back. So as introduced by Susu, my name is Athena. I'm from ICANN, the APAC office based in Singapore, and I am part of the stakeholder engagement team. So as part of my work, I cover economies in Southeast Asia, and that includes Myanmar. So without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation on the overview of ICANN. So I understand from feel that some of you are not as familiar with ICANN, and part of the reason why you are participating in today's webinar is because you want to know more about ICANN, and I hope my presentation will give you a very good understanding of that, and also will be a primer for the rest of the presentations that you are going to be hearing today. So to start off my presentation, I will share a little bit about how the internet works, because that is tied very closely with ICANN missions. To understand what we do is to basically understand how the internet works from a technical and infrastructure layer. So I'll be talking a little bit about the domain name and what the domain name system is, or DNS for short. Then I will go over the internet governance ecosystem, which is in short the partners that we work with very closely in order to achieve our mission. So I will do it from two angles. From the operational side, besides ourselves, we work very closely with regional internet registries, or RIs for short, as well as the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF for short. Then on the policy and the governance side, we have what we call our multi-stakeholder community, who either form or advise on policies that will impact the way we govern the internet infrastructure. Then I'll move on to some of the key issues that ICANN has been trying to address, and one of which is how do we make the internet more multilingual, which is the topic of today's webinar, UA acceptance. I will then also briefly go through some of the other issues, like how do we bring the unconnected online, and how do we deal with things like DNS abuse. And then finally, I will share a little bit about how you can stay in touch or even get involved if you wish to. So first, how does the internet work? So I believe for most of you, or anyone who has ever used the internet, you will be somewhat familiar with what you see on the screen. So for the domain name system, there are two parts. One is what we call the domain name. So what you see here, icann.org. Anyone who surfs the net, if you want to go to a web page, you will type in this thing, domain name, and it corresponds to what we call an Internet Protocol address, or IP address for short, which is a string of numbers. The reason why we don't just type in IP address, but a domain name, is because as humans or as people, we remember names better than a string of numbers. So that's why we have these two parts, the domain name and the IP address. Within the domain name itself, there are usually two parts that we commonly refer to. So anything after the dot, like here you'll see .org, is what we refer to as the top level domain. Anything in front of the dot is what we call the second level domain, or even third level domain if we go on towards the left side. So when we talk about domain names, this is roughly what we are referring to. And ICANN manages and coordinates the top level domain. So anything after the dot, or what we call the root level of the DNS. Every time you surf the net, what actually happens on the back end is what we call a DNS query, or a DNS resolution. So what happens is, if I type a domain name address, so for example, www.domain.org, and then the DNS will go through this entire system, which you will see on this slide here, which then eventually loads into the web page for you. And this entire process, from the moment you type in the domain name till the moment the web page loads on your device or your screen, is called the DNS query. And this usually happens within a very short time span of milliseconds, depending on your internet connection. So for ICANN, what we do is to coordinate the domain names through the domain name system. Sorry. Yeah, okay. And the DNS is important because without it, we will not have a global interoperable internet. What this means is that the DNS allows the internet to work the same way no matter which part of the world that you are at. And which is why our mission is One World, One Internet. Our role is to ensure a very effective and coordinated management of the domain names at the root level. So the top domain name, the top level domain, which I shared earlier, And this is the higher structure of the DNS structure. But we don't do this alone. We do this with technical partners like RIs and IETF, which I briefly mentioned, and I'm going to explain further to help keep the DNS working. So working with all these different partners and the different stakeholders within the ecosystem is what ensures that the internet that we know of remains stable, secure, and interoperable. So then who makes up the Internet Governance Ecosystem or IG ecosystem? So there are two ways to look at it. One is the operational angle. So the DNS or the internet is largely consists of three parts. So there's the domain names, which ICANN looks after. But in addition to ICANN, which looks after the top level domain name or the generic top level domain name to be precise. So things like .com, .net, .org. We have another group called the country code top level domain or CCTLD operators for short. And these are the ones who look after the top domain level, but specific to country codes. So for example, in Singapore, where I am, it will be SGNIC who looks after all domain names ending with .sg. Besides domain names, there's also the IP addresses, which I briefly talked about earlier, and these are managed by our regional internet registries, or RIIs for short. And these are further divided into regions. So for where we are at in APAC, including Myanmar, this is looked after by APNIC, Asia Pacific Network Information Center, and they are the ones who are responsible for managing and distributing the IP addresses within the Asia Pacific. Now, domain names correspond to IP addresses, but IP addresses and domain names need to operate within certain rules and parameters, and these are guided and informed by the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF for short. So they are the ones who manage and oversee the protocol parameters within the DNS. So from an operational angle, these are the three broad categories of partners that we work with. Now, from a governance and policy-making angle, we have what we call the ICANN multi-stakeholder community. And basically at ICANN, we believe very strongly in policy-making and governance of the internet infrastructure through a multi-stakeholder approach. What this means is that we follow a bottom-up model in which individuals, non-commercial organizations, industry, and even governments to try and form a consensus-driven and policy-making approach. And within the multi-stakeholder community, they are broadly organized into two groups. So one is the group that makes policies, and they consist of what we call the supporting organizations, or SOs for short. So they are responsible for developing policy recommendations in the areas that they look after, which are broadly IP addresses, generic top-level domains, or GTLDs for short, and country code top-level domains, or CCTLDs for short. Besides the policy-making bodies, we also have 4 other groups that provide advice to our ICANN board and community on policies that are being made in ICANN. And they come from 4 different areas. So the first group will be your governments and international organizations, or what we call the Government Advisory Committee, GAC for short. Then we have those who come from the root server operator group, the RSEC for short. The third group will be those who are looking after and provide advice on anything related to the internet security from a very technical angle. So they are what we call the Security and Stability Advisory Committee, SSEC for short. And finally, the last group belongs to anyone with an interest with what happens on the internet space. So it can be people like you and I, and we call them the Internet End Users, which form the At-Large Advisory Committee, or ALAC for short. So these are broadly how the multi-stakeholder community in ICANN operate. So what are some of the key issues that are currently being discussed or being addressed by the ICANN community? So the first one would be, how do we ensure that the internet that we have today and in the future becomes more multilingual? And that relates to the topic of today's webinar, the importance of universal acceptance as well as internationalized domain names. And some of the policy or questions that you commonly hear us talk about or discuss within the ICANN multi-stakeholder community would be, how do we make the internet